Okay, so you know A Clockwork Orange, right? You've probably at least seen like a clip or two of Kubrick's film.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those movies that sticks with you, even if you haven't seen the whole thing.
Exactly. But have you ever considered, and this is for you, the learner, that there might be a whole other side to this story?
Hmm.
Like something most people completely miss.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, so the author, Anthony Burgess, he actually kind of hated how much that movie overshadowed everything else he did.
Really?
Yeah. Like he wrote symphonies, sonatas, musicals, novels, all sorts of things. But all anyone wanted to talk about was that one ultra-violent story.
It's like, I don't know, Rachmaninoff only being known for that one prelude, or people constantly asking Beethoven about some simple little minuet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today, going way deeper than just the surface violence and the stuff that usually gets all the attention.
I like it. Count me in.
Right, so full disclosure, you sent over some really fascinating sources for me to look at. Excerpts from Burgess's own introduction to a later American edition, plus the publisher's note explaining some key differences between versions, and of course some pretty intense passages from the book itself.
Oh, yeah, those were fascinating.
And even just reading those notes, you start to get this feeling like maybe the whole story hasn't been, fully understood. Like maybe not in the way the author really intended.
You know what? You're totally right. I got that same feeling when I was reading the sources. It's like, wow, there's so much more to this than what you see on the surface.
All right, so let's get right into it then. And this is a genuine aha moment, the learner. It turns out there are two different endings to A Clockwork Orange, like two completely different versions. There's the original British version, and then there's the one published in America, which was, well, shall we say, modified.
Modified. I like that.
And get this, the American one, the one Kubrick based his film on,
Yeah.
is missing a whole final chapter. Like the last chapter just isn't there.
Oh.
And that missing chapter changes the whole meaning of the book. Burgess himself said so. So for you, the learner, how does knowing this, like knowing that a whole chunk of the story is often just left out, change how you view what the book is really saying?
That's a really interesting question to consider right off the bat. I mean, it makes you think about the author's intention, right? Like, what was Burgess actually trying to say with his story?
Totally.
And then you have this whole other layer of how the film adaptation, which so many people know, has basically become the dominant interpretation.
Right.
It's fascinating.
Totally. And before we get into those two different endings, we need to talk about the super unique language in the book. Nadsat.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes the book so memorable.
Right. It's this crazy mix of English slang and Russian words, like something out of a dystopian future.
Totally. It's almost like its own character in the story.
It is.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting part. For you, the learner, even though it's using all this Cold War era language, the narrator, Alex, isn't political at all.
You're right. There's a definite irony there.
Right. It's like you'd expect this language to be tied to some kind of ideology, but it's not. At least not for Alex.
Yeah, it's like he's completely oblivious to the political implications of the words he's using.
Exactly. Now, don't worry, we're not going to force you to learn all the Nadsat words or anything. We'll give you some examples so you get the idea.
Right, like horror show for good or droog for friend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the real goal today, for you, the learner, is to get to the heart of what Burgess was trying to say. What were his intentions? What's the big deal with the two different endings? And really, what are the deeper themes he was exploring, especially this idea of free will versus being forced to be good?
It's a big question.
It is. So let's start with Burgess himself. Like, how did he feel about how his book was received? What was his perspective?
Well, right from the start, he expresses a lot of frustration. Like, he felt that a lot of people just didn't get it.
Like, how so?
Like, they assumed he was glorifying violence, which he completely denies. Yeah. He keeps coming back to this idea of freedom of choice being super important.
Like, that it's more important than anything else.
He even says, and this is a direct quote, "It is better to have our streets infested with murderous young hoodlums than to deny individual freedom of choice."
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you think that means for us today, the learner? Like, how does that hold up in today's world?
I think it's a really challenging idea, especially in a world where we're constantly trying to make things safer.
Right. And I guess it really makes you think about the whole idea of freedom and what it really means.
Right.
And it's not just that, right?
Yeah.
Burgess was also kind of bummed about how the movie focused so much on the violence and the sex.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He felt like Kubrick missed the point.
like he was trying to say something deeper.
Exactly. For Burgess, the language was a huge part of the story, and that obviously got lost in the film adaptation.
That makes sense. A movie is going to be more visual.
Right. And that brings us to the whole issue of the two different endings.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting for you, the learner. So Burgess felt that Kubrick's ending, which again is based on that shorter American version, actually kind of twisted his message.
Like, it took it in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So in the movie, Alex is supposedly cured all right, but there's this sense that he's still, capable of violence.
And Burgess saw that as almost an endorsement of that violent nature.
Exactly. Like the film ends up celebrating the urge to sin, as he put it.
Oh, wow.
But the original ending, the one that got cut out, is completely different.
How so?
Well, in that version, Alex grows up. Like he matures and leaves his violent phase behind. He even falls in love and wants to start a family. The whole decent bourgeois life.
So a much more hopeful ending.
Yeah. And that was Burgess's point all along. He wanted to show that violence can be a phase, something people grow out of.
Like it's a part of adolescence that we can move beyond.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. Kubrick didn't even know about that original ending when he made the film. Yeah, he said so himself. So basically, he took the story and went in a completely different direction.
It's amazing how much one missing chapter can change the whole meaning of a story.
It really is, and it's super important to keep in mind for you, the learner, as we go deeper into this. Now, one of the key things in the story is this thing called Ludovico's technique. Basically, it's this process designed to make people stop being violent. Have you ever heard of anything like that, the learner?
Oh, yeah. It's like a really extreme form of aversion therapy.
Right. It's pretty messed up, honestly. Like they strap Alex to a chair, force his eyes open, and make him watch all these violent films.
And they inject him with something that makes him super sick every time he sees violence.
It's brutal. And they do it with his favorite classical music playing, so he ends up associating that beauty with feeling awful. Talk about psychological torture.
It's like they're trying to completely rewire his brain.
Exactly. And in the middle of all this, you get this really crucial point from the prison chaplain. He says, and this is really important, goodness is something chosen. When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
Boom. Mic drop moment right there.
Right. Like he's saying that if you force someone to be good, it doesn't really mean anything.
It takes away their agency, their humanity even.
And that goes back to that idea of Alex becoming a clockwork orange,
Yeah.
like a wind-up toy that looks human but isn't really free.
He becomes a product of his conditioning rather than being capable of making his own moral choices.
Right. And it's worth asking, what's the government really after here? Are they actually trying to rehabilitate criminals, or is there something else going on?
Well, the book makes it pretty clear that they're not really interested in genuine moral change. It's more about control and efficiency.
Like keeping the streets safe and the prisons from overflowing.
Exactly. They see criminals like Alex as basically broken machines that need to be fixed.
And that's kind of interesting because Alex himself seems to believe in the idea of original sin. Like we're all born with a bad side.
Yeah, he says something like, badness is of the self, implying that it's something inherent in human nature.
Which is kind of the opposite of what the government believes, right?
They think it's all just a reflex, something that can be cured with the right technique.
It's like Burgess is playing with these different ideas about where morality comes from,
Like, are we born with a capacity for both good and evil, or are we blank slates that society shapes?
Exactly. And then he throws this other question in there too, which is whether being good has anything to do with enjoying beautiful things.
You mean like Alex's love of classical music?
Yeah. Like, just because he loves Beethoven, does that make him a good person?
Clearly not in his case.
Right. And then the way they use that music against him in the Ludovico's technique is just so messed up.
It's like they're taking something beautiful and pure and twisting it into a weapon.
And that's interesting because it raises questions about how art and culture can be used, right?
Like, can they really make us better people, or can they just as easily be used to manipulate us?
It's a great question for you, the learner, to think about, especially in today's world with all the media we consume.
Totally. And while we're on the topic of manipulation, we can't ignore the whole political backdrop of the story, right?
Right. Like, the book is set in this dystopian future where the government controls pretty much everything.
Housing, jobs, media. They even call films state film. which is pretty chilling.
And then there's the whole Ludovico's technique itself, which is the ultimate form of government control, right?
Totally. It's like Burgess is warning us about what can happen when the state gets too much power.
Especially when it comes to trying to control our minds and our behavior.
Exactly. And it's not just the government, right? He also seems to be critiquing youth culture itself.
You mean like with the Nadsat and Alex's immaturity?
Exactly. He's highlighting the kind of mindless violence and rebellion that can come with being young.
And the way he uses language to do that is just brilliant.
Like appy palamuj for apology or eggy-wag for egg.
It's almost like baby talk, which makes their violence seem even more disturbing.
It's like they're stuck in this state of arrested development.
Okay, so to really illustrate all this, for you, the learner, let's look at a few specific scenes from the book. Remember that part where Alex and his droogs attack that old teacher after leaving the library?
Oh, yeah, the daughtery, starry, schoolmaster type Vec.
Right. What gets you about that scene?
Well, first of all, it's just so casual. Like, violence is just a normal part of their day.
They literally called him a lanky jest, a little joke.
And the fact that he just came from the library makes it even more disturbing.
It's like they're attacking knowledge itself.
And then there's the scene where we see the painting in Alex's apartment, the one with all the crude drawings on it.
Right, that municipal painting with the embellishments.
It's like a symbol of their whole environment, you know, this disregard for anything beautiful or meaningful.
And then there's that visit from PR Deltoid, Alex's post-corrective advisor.
Oh, yeah, that guy was a joke.
He's supposed to be helping Alex, but he's clearly just going through the motions.
It's like he's given up on actually trying to reach these kids.
And then we see Alex in prison, where he's supposedly getting a further education in prison religion.
And that's where he meets the chaplain, who really challenges him on this whole idea of forced goodness.
Right. And the chaplain is super disturbed by the whole Ludovico's technique thing.
He sees it as a violation of Alex's free will, even if it means he might keep committing crimes.
In a way, Burgess describes Alex's experience during those sessions is just brutal.
The nausea, the feeling of being completely trapped.
And the way they use his love of music against him, turning it into a source of pain.
It's like they're trying to erase his humanity bit by bit.
And then there's that demonstration where they show off how cured Alex is, and you have Dr. Brodsky all excited, and the chaplain totally horrified.
They represent the two sides of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Science versus morality.
Exactly. And then you have that really sad scene where Alex goes home, and his parents have basically replaced him.
Oh, yeah, with that lodger named Joe.
It's like he doesn't even have a place in his own family anymore.
And then he gets attacked by those old tramps, and he can't even defend himself because of the conditioning.
Which is so ironic, right? He used to be the one attacking helpless people.
It's like the universe is giving him a taste of his own medicine.
And then his old droogs, Georgie and Dim, show up as policemen.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
It shows how power corrupts and how violence can become this endless cycle.
And then he ends up seeking help from F. Alexander, the writer whose wife he attacked.
Right. Like, how messed up is that situation?
It's like the ultimate test of forgiveness, or maybe just a recipe for disaster.
And throughout all of this, we see that Alex hasn't really changed on the inside.
Even though he can't act on his violent urges, he still has them.
And those dreams he has, both before and after the conditioning, really show that.
Like he's still that same ultra-violent Alex underneath it all.
And then there's that final scene in the original British ending where we see Pete living a normal life with a wife and kid.
It's like a glimpse of what Alex could have had if he'd chosen a different path.
It's a powerful contrast, showing that genuine change is possible, but it has to come from within.
And that's what Burgess was trying to say all along, right?
Totally. So, just to recap all this for you, the learner, we've seen how the two different endings changed the whole meaning of A Clockwork Orange, how Burgess was obsessed with this idea of free will, and how messed up the whole Ludovico's technique thing really is. We've also talked about how the book is kind of a warning about too much government control, and how it also critiques youth culture and mindless violence.
And it raises all these deeper questions about the nature of good and evil, the role of art in society, and whether we're really capable of changing who we are at our core.
Totally. So here's something to ponder for you, the learner. If Burgess was so convinced that freedom of choice is paramount, even when it leads to bad things happening, what does that mean for us today?
Like, how much control should society have over individual behavior?
Right. And does it really matter if our intentions are good, if the outcome is basically the same?
It's a tough question with no easy answers.
It is. And we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, whether it's by reading more of Burgess's work, diving into the philosophical debates about free will, or even just thinking critically about the media you consume every day.
And if you're feeling really ambitious, look into the concept of cacotopia, which Burgess used to describe these really bleak dystopian futures.
It's basically the opposite of a utopia, where everything is bad.
It's a sobering thought, but definitely worth considering in light of A Clockwork Orange and the world we live in today.
Absolutely. So we hope this deep dive has been illuminating and that it encourages you to keep thinking critically about the things you read and watch.
After all, that's what makes a story truly impactful, isn't it? When it stays with you and makes you question your own assumptions about the world.
Exactly. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.
Happy learning, everyone!